My perspective, which I've summarized in a book called The Corruption of Capitalism, is essentially that the neoliberal economics revolution that is associated with Reagan and Thatcher that began in the 1980s, which was around the rhetoric of free markets and around the rhetoric of individualism and competition, has ended up creating the most unfree market economy that has ever existed. And it really deserves to be called rentier capitalism. Because what has been happening is that more and more of the income has flowed to the owners of property. Financial property, physical property, and intellectual property. And less has been going to those who perform labor. So that the functional distribution of income, this is a term that we economists use, has become more and more unequal. And this is a global phenomenon associated with global rentier capitalism. The share going to capital has gone up, share going to labor has gone down, but the share going to the rentiers through gaining extras has gone up even more. And what happened in the 1990s was that the international architecture of rentier capitalism was constructed. And the single most influential piece of legislation is a piece of legislation called TRIPS, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. And what that did was globalize the American intellectual property rights system, and it was led by the chief executive of Pfizer. You may have heard of Pfizer. And that guarantees monopoly profits to the owners of patents. So now, every year, more than 3 million patents are filed, and each and every patent guarantees the owner of the patent a monopoly profit for 20 years. And with pharmaceuticals, it can be extended for another 20 years. And so billions and billions of dollars are going to the owners of intellectual property. That's the first thing. The second thing is that rent has not gone just to the top 1% or the top 0.1%. That's journalistic simplicity. In fact, about a quarter of the population, the top 2 deciles of the income distribution, have done very well out of rentier capitalism. Their property values, their shares, and so on have gone up enormously. The third point I want to make is that what happened in the 1980s and 1990s was that they opened the door to domination by finance. Financial capital has become the tail that is wagging the dog. Basically, big finance, schools, apprentices, people who become politicians, and then those politicians go back and work in big finance. And it's really Goldman Sachsism. So Rishi Sunak, for example, spends 4 years being trained by Goldman Sachs. Then when he becomes Chancellor, he brings in Goldman Sachs people as advisors. The Governor of the Bank of England, Goldman Sachs trained. The Governor of the European Central Bank, Goldman Sachs trained. You go on and on about the revolving doors between finance and politics. Now, I'll give you a couple of stylized facts about Britain today. Because of this composition of type of capitalism, financial assets of financial institutions in this country come to over 1,000% of our national income. 1,000%, okay? And while income inequality has increased dramatically in that period, while we've had slow growth and lower taxes, coincidentally, wealth has risen relative to income. So wealth in this country used to be about 300% of national income. Now it's over 700%. And wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality, but wealth is hardly taxed. Wealth is hardly taxed at all. And yet over 60% of total wealth in this country is inherited wealth. So you cannot say it was earned or that it's merited. It's inherited. So you have that situation. Now, the awkward problem for those who say cut tax and we'll get growth is they've cut taxes for the last 40, 50 years. And this is the period of slowest growth in our history. So how long do these low tax regimes have to last before they get this magical growth? The last point I want to make is don't make a fetish of growth. Growth of what? Growth of GDP? The work that more people do than any other form of work, that has more value than any work I know, is not counted in growth, it's not counted in GDP, and that's care work by women. How ridiculous. Why do we want to increase growth if it means less care? I leave that as my final question. But I do think we have to rethink fiscal policy, rethink how we want to organize our lives, and this is a crisis moment where we're going to see millions and millions of people outside food banks, hygiene banks, suicidal, relying on universal credit, the worst social policy we've ever had. It's a real crisis moment. Thank you.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.